Good evening. Welcome to our fifth of our native plant school classes, no-fail natives. My name is Scott Vogt. I'm the executive director here and horticulturist for Dyck Arboretum of the Plains. I want to welcome each of you to this class. There's a lot of people interested in natives, and hopefully you can get some of your answers through this class and some of the others yet to come, or come to our plant sale coming up April 22nd for members, or the 23rd through the 26th for the general public. If you haven't already, I encourage you to put an online order in for the spring plant sale. You can do that just by going to our website and looking under Flora, Kansas. It's also on one of the sliders as well. I encourage you to put an order in for our plant sale. If you haven't already, Katie Schmidt, our horticulturist, will be teaching the last class of our native plant school classes this spring on April 8th, called Lawn to Lush, creating a native front yard, which she has done in her own front yard in North Newton. So I encourage you to sign up for that. That's a really important topic, a lot of interest in removing and reducing lawns and converting those to native plantings. This coming Tuesday, March 30th, is our last of our winter lecture series classes. Will be an online class with Tony Capizzo from the Nature Conservancy, talking about conservation and stewardship in the Flint Hills, which should be a really good program as well. As we go through this program, if you have questions, I encourage you to submit those by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of the screen and submitting those questions, and I'll review those and go over those at the end of the program. So let's go ahead and get started. So site considerations. One of the things that, as I begin to put this program together, thinking of no-fill natives, and I was thinking, is there such a thing as a no-fill native? And I think that there are plants that are quite adaptable to a lot of different kinds of soils, a lot of different kinds of sun exposure, but there isn't any plant out there that I know of that can grow in every situation, every soil situation, every sun situation. So it's really important for you to become familiar with your site. And I harp on this a lot, but this is one of the most critical steps when you're thinking of your own design and how you and the plants that you want to incorporate within your landscape. It's really important to understand your site, to look at it at different times of the year. You know, what kind of sun does it get? Does it get direct sun, indirect sun, dappled shade? What kind of soil does it have? Is it heavy clay soil? Is it sandy soil? Is it really moist throughout the year? Does it have drainage issues? Does it change throughout the seasons, from spring through winter, through summer? Does it have root competition from trees, oak trees, versus, say, a silver maple, which has very shallow root systems? Look at all of these kinds of things. Is there structures that provide shade, provide protection for certain types of plants, especially shade plants, from the hot, dry winds? Is there paths or infrastructure that you want to incorporate prior to planting? All of these things need to be taken into consideration and before you plant, because again, as I said before, there is a plant palette that fits just about any landscape situation out there, but it's really important to understand all of these factors about your site. If you go to a prairie, within a prairie, there's diversity from the top of the hill to the lower areas of a prairie. You see different plants growing in that drier environment. You see different plants growing in that wetter environment, and very seldom do you do they intermingle? And that's really important to think about. What plant communities grow in a sunny, dry area, or an area that's dappled shade, morning sun, afternoon shade, or the hottest part of the afternoon, areas that maybe stay a little bit moist. There's plant communities from each one of those, and that helps you determine what types of plants to incorporate within that setting. One of the best teaching tools that experiences that I had when I first started working here, we used to take road trips, 55-mile-an-hour botany. We would look at different plant sites, different plant communities. Went up by Wilson Lake, Canopolis. We went to Northwest Kansas, Southwest Kansas, into the Flint Hills, and up towards Kansas City. And within those different geographic areas, there was different plants. And again, you would see plants that were exposed to full sun, top of hills, drier conditions, the plants that were growing there versus plants that were growing in the lower areas. And again, that helped form and help me understand a little bit more about what types of plants grow in which types of environments. So it's really important to try to match these plants up to the site that you have. As we get to the end of the program, I'll have some lists of groupings of plants, say for a rock garden or for clay that can handle clay soils, and as kind of a starting point for thinking about your own garden design. But the other thing that you may want to try to do is do some soil preparation. And it's really, I've had some success with this, but generally what happens is by adding a lot of organic matter, adding a lot of compost to a soil, and sometimes you need to because you have a lot of subsoil, especially new construction. But oftentimes, again, there is a plant community there that can handle those kinds of conditions, can grow in those kinds of conditions. And oftentimes by adding a lot of organic matter, it's the death of a lot of native plants. So adding too much compost, making the soil too rich, say for pale purple coneflower or rose verbena. These are plants that need and thrive in areas where there's good drainage, and the water can get away from the crowns of the plants. The death of these plants is heavy clay soil, a situation where the soil stays wet for a long period of time. We've had rain up to 5 inches here in the last couple of weeks, and oftentimes that's the death of some of these plants, these native plants that are not actively growing right now, but their crowns are saturated and surrounded by extremely moist, cool soil, and they just don't like that kind of environment. They like that quick draining, getting the water away from the crowns of the plants. And adding organic matter, which holds moisture, is the death of these plants. So again, sometimes you may have to add some organic matter, but oftentimes you can get away with just trying to plant and choosing plants that can grow in kind of those low fertility situations that you may have, again, especially in new construction sites. The other thing that can be really a downfall, can be problematic with a planting, is not getting perennial weeds under control. Bindweed, Bermuda grass. If you don't do your work up front in eradicating these, eliminating these from your garden area, it's really going to be problematic, detrimental, harmful to the plants down the road because of that intense competition, the root systems that these plants have. So the best time to control these is in late summer, early fall, as those plants are starting to move nutrients from the leaves down into the root systems, translocate those chemicals. A couple applications of Roundup. I'm not a big proponent of using Roundup, but it's really, really important to get these under control. And that's one of the best methods that we found here of eliminating these weeds prior to planting. And then, and again, if you don't have these weeds under control, I'd encourage you to postpone your planting until you do get these weeds under control. If you take these if you do these kinds of work ahead of time, like learning your site, getting weeds under control, and then trying to choose plants then accordingly that match the site, you'll have a lot more success down the road with your own planting. So let's go ahead and look at some wildflowers and grasses. Now these will be plants, wildflowers, grasses that need at least 6 hours of direct sunlight for them to be happy. And we have a list of shade plants later on that we'll go through as well. So this will go through these pretty quickly. Essentially, this is a list that's compiled. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of plants that you could choose from. These are ones that we've had success with growing here at the Arboretum, installing these into designs that we put together for businesses and homeowners. But these are for sunny areas. So sassy, summer lemon, different kinds of achilleas. There's white forms, there's yellow forms, coronation gold. It's kind of a tried and true form. Need pretty good drainage. Will slowly spread, frilly foliage. But this is a nice one for early spring bloom. Amsonia, it's a plant that doesn't get utilized enough in the landscape. This is a shorter form called blue ice. Amsonia blue ice, blue flowers, darker blue flowers in the springtime. And then the whole entire plant turns a nice yellow in the fall. I like to intermingle this with, say, some prairie dropseed or some little blue stem, which really looks good in combination, especially later in the fall as the plant turns more of a yellowish color. Amsonia hubrichtii, or willow leaf blue star, has more fine foliage, lighter blue flowers, gets a little bit taller, 3 foot by 3 foot. A whole bank of these, say 10 plants in a row together, look really spectacular because as the top of this picture shows, they turn a nice golden yellow later in the season. Mix this with, say, some switchgrass or a red leaf switchgrass like Cheyenne Sky. That combination looks really good later in the season. One that has a little bit darker flowers, a little bit darker shoots early in the spring. Storm Cloud, this is again another Amsonia. Gets 2 to 3 feet tall and 2 to 3 feet wide. Darker blue flowers, can grow in partial shade as could willow leaf, sunflower. Quite adaptable. I have some in partial shade, partial and in full sun, and they do equally well. Maybe get a little bit fuller in the full sunlight, but a nice plant for early spring bloom. Looks attractive throughout the growing season, and then has, again, beautiful fall color. Different kinds of butterfly milkweed, and milkweeds are really important for the life cycle of monarchs. Butterfly milkweed probably isn't the plant of choice as far as milkweeds go, but in a horticulture setting, in a display, say around a home, it's a clump growing plant versus, say, common milkweed or Sullivan's milkweed, which slowly spreads, forms a colony over time and can take over entire flower beds. So I love the orange flowers of butterfly milkweed. Monarchs still like it. If you're looking to incorporate other milkweeds, put those towards the peripherals of your landscape so that they're available to the monarchs, because the monarchs will find them. They say that a monarch can find a nectar source, milkweed, from up to 2 miles away, and so they're honed in on these plants, especially as they're migrating both north and south. But milkweeds are extremely important. Butterfly milkweed blooms in late spring, early summer, and there's yellow forms, there's darker red forms, but this is typically what you would get of a plant that gets 2 foot by 2 foot. The close-up of the blooms. Pollinators really love these plants. Different kinds of asters. This is October skies, light blue, light lavender flowers in late September and into October. Had this blooming here at the Arboretum clear into November. extends the bloom season. Plants are really tidy, only getting 2 foot by 2 foot. So it forms a nice, attractive bush. These are more of the structure plants that we've talked about in the past, but really a beautiful plant that looks good both as it's growing during the growing season. When it's in full bloom, pollinators flock to this as the seasons are changing in the fall. Grape crush. Incidentally, I'll go back to October skies. Another good one that I incorporate in a lot of designs is another aromatic aster, radon's favorite. And it is a plant that will slowly spread. It doesn't stay as a clump like October skies. So again, you have to think of the form and being able and willing to maybe divide that radon's favorite every 3 to 5 years. But it has a little bit darker blooms, still attractive foliage throughout the growing season, and pollinators like it just as much as October skies. A new form that we're trying out this year, it's a variety of New England aster grape crush, darker purple blooms than the radon's favorite or the October skies. Only gets about 2 foot tall. But again, blooms later in the season. Just has a little bit darker blooms. Doesn't seem to. New England asters generally start to lose the leaves at the bottom of the plant, and they kind of look unsightly and with the later in the season. But this seems to be able to stay more of a mound and has a little bit darker purple blooms than some of the others. Dwarf wild indigo has these keel-like blooms, long-lived plant. We've had some here in certain areas within the Arboretum for 20 years, over 20 years now, come back year after year. But this plant is one you want to make sure that you, when you plant it, because you can't remove it without essentially killing it, because it has a taproot that can go down 10 to 15 feet deep. So it's a very long-lived, very drought-tolerant plant, but a very beautiful plant, especially in mass with these dark pea-like blooms in the early spring. These pea-like blooms then develop into black seed pods, which are attractive later in the season as well. But a plant that you see in south central Kansas here and into the Flint Hills, and is really nice plant for early spring bloom. Different forms, there's yellow forms, there's pink forms, there's darker purple forms. This is one called lemon meringue. There's one called blueberry sundae, indigo spires. There's pink forms like pink truffle. Lots of different hybridization, but nice plants for structure towards the back of a bed. Mix these with, say, northwind switchgrass or Cheyenne sky, totem pole switchgrass, big blue stem. Really look good in combination later in the season then too, after they bloom in the spring. Different kinds of coreopsis. This is early sunrise, Coreopsis grandiflora. There's lanceolata varieties. Blooms in the spring. You can keep them blooming throughout and into summer by simply deadheading them when they're done blooming. Pollinators love these. This is a variety called Jethro Tull. Again, blooms in late spring, early summer. If you deadhead these, when they're done blooming, pull off the spent blooms, they will rebloom for you. Again, pollinators love these and flock to them when they're in bloom. As I mentioned earlier, pale purple coneflower, if you see this growing out in the wild in eastern Kansas into Missouri and Arkansas, oftentimes it's in rocky outcroppings, very lean soil, and that's what it prefers. That's where it prefers to be planted. Heavy clay soils, it's not going to be happy unless there's some way that you can rake in a raised bed setting where you can get the moisture away from the crown of the plant. It needs it is more adaptable, say, than the narrow leaf coneflower, which is more of a western Kansas species, but it needs more quick drainage away from the crowns of the plant. Gets 3 to 4 feet tall, has nice frilly, long ray petals, blooms in late May and into June. Yellow purple coneflower, that's the paradox. This is one that has been utilized for hybridization of some of the newer coneflower forms, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but very adaptable plant. Works great in combination with little blue stem, and is a plant that you can that finches like, birds like, will eat the seeds, especially during the winter months. So I like to keep the seed heads up through the winter as a food source for a lot of different kinds of overwintering birds. But a plant that should be in just about any landscape, especially areas that get have nice sunny locations. There's lots of different forms out there. I just chose this salsa red because I like the red color of the flower. There's oranges, there's yellows, there's different shades of pink. There's orange and pink, like the Marcella, rainbow Marcella, echinacea. But the thing with these is they're bred to be repeat bloomers. So encourage you, if you have these in your landscape, or if you have include these within your plan, that you begin in late August into September, start deadheading those, and it forces the plant then to root. But they're quite adaptable, can go in partial sun to full sun. But I love the varieties of colors that they're coming out with. Sometimes it's hard to choose which variety that you want, but I really love these sombrero varieties. Yellows and oranges seem to have good success with those. Rattlesnake master, it's a very unique plant, eye-catching, as the description says there. Yucca-like foliage, has these kind of powdery balls in the summer months. Gets 3 to 4 feet tall by 1 to 2 foot wide. I like to intermingle this again with little blue stem or some kind of switchgrass, because it really looks attractive later in the season as this plant starts to turn more of a tannish color as it begins to go dormant. But a great architectural plant that should be utilized more in the landscape, similar to how I feel about Amsonia. Heliopsis helianthoides, Tuscan sun. There's a variety called Summer Nights. This is one that needs a little more consistent moisture, but it can be quite adaptable once you finally get it established. And it's blooms at a time when not a lot of other plants are blooming, from midsummer, usually in July and August into September. It's a later season bloomer. Very vibrant yellow blooms, and is quite drought tolerant once you get it established, which usually takes a year or two. Missouri, Rebecca missouriensis, 18 to 24 inches tall. This is a true perennial, comes back year after year. A plant that I've really come to enjoy, again, because it blooms at a time when not a lot of other plants are blooming. Plant this in combination with purple prairie clover, because they bloom at the same time. Nice combinations of the yellows and pinks together. But again, blooms in July and August, and is a true perennial, comes back year after year. We have some plants that have been in the same location now for about 7 or 8 years and keep coming back. And compare this to some of the Rebecca Herta varieties. I really like this form. Different kinds of liatris. This is a white form. There's purple cobalt forms. Literally, there's a liatris for just about any kind of setting, from wet to dry, from tall to short. One of the tricks to making these liatris stand out within a landscape is to plant in larger quantities. one plant typically only puts up 1 or 2 shoots. So to have a really nice looking mass of plants such as this slide here, this is probably 10 or 15 liatris planted all in close proximity to one another, similar to in the background the coneflower Echinacea pallida. But again, literally there is a liatris for any location within a landscape. Cherry pops, bee balm, different kinds of bee balm. I really love the different colors that are available, from reds to pinks to purples. It's really important to, these are more clump formers. They will slowly spread, but they're not going to take over like Monarda fistulosa would. I love Monarda fistulosa, which is the true native form of bee balm. But again, like common milkweed or Sullivan's milkweed, it's something that can take over a more formal bed, and pretty soon all that you will have is Monarda fistulosa or wild bee balm. Encourage you to utilize this again in the peripheral areas of your landscape. Some of these newer forms are a little bit more manageable, but the true Monarda fistulosa is one that you want to move towards the outskirts of your property. Missouri evening primrose blooms in the spring. I like it spilling over rock walls. Needs good drainage. You find this growing in rocky hillsides, exposed sites, some of the most terrible soil you can imagine, and that's where it thrives the best. It comes back year after year because it's got that good drainage. Don't plant this in an area where it's going to stay consistently moist. We have it in some raised beds here. We have it along a rock wall that's raised. And again, these plants come back year after year, but it's really important to have good drainage. Spread's only going to get maybe 8 to 12 inches tall and 8 to 12 inches in spread. Penstemon dark towers, beard tongue. There's lots of different kinds of penstemon. This is probably the most widely adaptable. This is a variety of smooth penstemon. Has this darker foliage. You may be familiar with Husker red, is another form of smooth penstemon, but pinkish flowers, burgundy foliage that looks attractive even when it's not in bloom. There is other penstemons, but most of those, like shell-leaf penstemon or cobea penstemon, like you could intermingle those with, say, some evening primrose or plants that need keen drainage, quick draining soil. Again, we have some cobea penstemon, which is one of my favorites. It's come back year after year in an area, a raised bed area where there's good drainage, and the crown doesn't stay moist for long periods of time. It thrives in areas where there's really good drainage, but this is one that's more adaptable, can get up to 3 foot tall, blooms in the springtime. Pollinators, I've seen hummingbirds on this. I've seen some of those huge bumblebees, lots of different pollinators crawling in and out of these, flying around these plants when they're in bloom. Rudbeckia, American Gold Rush. This is a little bit out of order, but this is a new form, American Gold Rush. You may be more familiar with the Rudbeckia Goldstrom. This is a form that is a lot more resistant to disease. Has a nice texture, blooms for a long period of time, but the foliage stays clean. Any more Goldstrom is problematic because of the disease that the foliage gets. This is a nice form, American Gold Rush. Another new form is Glitters Like Gold, is another good Rudbeckia form. Solidago rigida, different kinds of goldenrod are really important, especially to mix with some of the late blooming asters, some of the native grasses later in the season. can be really attractive. Goldenrods get a bad rap for causing allergies, and that's not true. They bloom, they have the unfortunate timing of their bloom at the same time that the giant ragweed is dispensing huge quantities of yellow pollen in the air. So goldenrods are a pollinator favorite. Rigid goldenrod has this flat top flower that is really attractive and pollinators love. Lots of other forms, gray goldenrod, fireworks, Wichita Mountains. There's lots of different forms, lots of different sizes and shapes, textures to include within your garden design. Vernonia iron butterflies. It's a plant that we started utilizing and growing here at the Arboretum probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and it's been really, really resilient. The typical pastured iron plant can be really coarse, not very attractive. This Lettermanii iron butterflies has finer foliage, dark purple blooms, very similar foliage to Amsonia, but just blooms at a different time of the year. And a nice form that only gets about 18 to 24 inches tall and wide. So different kinds of grasses. Blackhawks is a form of big blue stem, can get 5 feet tall. There's Red October, there's Pawnee. Those are also forms of big blue stem that you can utilize within a garden design. But this is some of the newer forms like Red October and Blackhawks have consistent attractive fall color and are a little bit more stiffly upright, don't have a tendency to flop over. Butaloa gracilis, blonde ambition. This is attractive, called eyelash grass. Mix this with some shorter perennials along the front of a border. You could grow this with evening primrose. You could grow this with purple poppy mallow or rose verbena along the front of a walkway or in a raised bed that has good drainage. But it's quite adaptable to drier conditions or heavier clay soils. We have some growing in both situations, and it's quite adaptable. Really looks good later in the season with these eyelash or sickle-like flower heads. Pink muhly grass, clouds of pink blooms later in the season. This is again one that needs good drainage. This is a plant of the Southwest. It's related to or similar to some of the sand lovegrass forms, but it has these frilly pink blooms that look really attractive. Grown these in pots with some other perennials, and it's done well in that kind of a setting too that gets full sun. But a nice plant for late season interest, late season bloom, because this forms a nice purple haze, especially when planted in mass with 10 or 15 other of the same variety. Different kinds of switchgrass. Northwind is one of my favorites. Cheyenne Sky. You see a lot of switchgrasses in roadside ditches, and so you know that they can take some periodic floodings, can grow in some heavier soil, but there's a lot of great forms out there. I love Northwind because it doesn't flop over. I love Cheyenne Sky or Ruby Ribbons because of the red foliage that it has, and you can see what that looks like later in the season as it develops the seed heads and those red leaves become more prominent. Twilight Zone is a favorite of mine for as a little blue stem. I love the purplish foliage. I love the fall color that has more tinges of reds and oranges and purple, lavender on the stems. Has a tendency in really rich soil to flop over. So if you have a really rich soil, you may want to choose a variety like Standing Ovation or Jazz. Those are a little bit shorter, or Munchkin is another form. Those are a little bit shorter forms, but I love this Twilight Zone because it looks good not only throughout the growing season with that purple tinges of foliage, but in the fall as it transitions to autumn. Blue Heaven, gets a little bit taller, can be up to almost 5 feet. Again, prefers to be in kind of lean soil. Will flop over because it's so tall in really rich soil, but blue, steely blue foliage, tinges of reds and burgundies in there, and then beautiful fall color in September and October. Prairie dropseed, I incorporate this in a lot of designs. Fountain grass appearance and fragrant blooms. The blooms aren't so dense that you can't see through them, but they're still attractive even throughout the growing season. I like to alternate this with, say, Missouri evening primrose or Missouri black-eyed Susan, or a shorter native aster like snow flurry, Aster ericoides snow flurry. Really look good in combination and looks good. The entire plant will turn a nice yellow in the fall. So here's a list of some of those plants that we just talked about. Encourage you to look over this list. Again, become familiar with the growing conditions that they prefer, and that'll help you to determine which plants to include in your overall design. Moving on to some some shade plants. Wild columbine is quite adaptable, can grow in full sun to partial shade to full shade. Here at the Arboretum, we grow mostly under where it gets some morning sun and then afternoon shade, kind of protected from the hottest part of the day. Blooms in the spring. I oftentimes, when it's done blooming, will shear off those old spent blooms, and then you have that nice amount of attractive foliage closer to the ground. But there's yellow forms called Corbett. Canyon Vista has a darker red flower, but it is quite adaptable to a lot of different kinds of conditions. White woodland aster, Aster divaricatus eastern star. There's a lot of spring blooming ephemerals, and you're looking for plants that bloom later in the season. This would be a good choice. This is kind of a weaver that will slowly spread. It's not aggressive in how it fills in, but a plant that I really come to enjoy. Tiny white flowers with mahogany stems, and it is kind of a weaver that will kind of fill in as a ground cover in a shady area. A taller form of aster that blooms in September and October, gets 3 foot by 3 foot, is this Aster cordifolius Avondale. Has more of a light pink or lavender bloom. Again, blooms later in the season, add some splashes of color at a shady spot in the landscape. Has a tendency to self-seed, so it may be a plant that you want to initially plant on a riverbank and kind of let it fill in along with maybe some river oats or something like that. Different kinds of epimediums. There's yellow forms, there's pink forms, there's red forms. Blooms early in the season, is quite adaptable to a lot of different kinds of soil conditions, but needs shade. Needs a little bit of protection from the hottest part and desiccating winds. But I love those early spring blooms, almost spider-like blooms above the attractive and persistent foliage. Wild geranium has dark pink or dark purple blooms, dissected foliage. It's quite adaptable. I've seen this, I've grown this in some morning sun, afternoon shade, or also in a full shade location, and it's happy in both of those situations. Blooms in the springtime, gets about 12 to 15 inches tall by 12-inch spread. So you don't want to space these about 12 inches apart. Different kinds of coral bells. These are great in a pot. I have grown some different kinds of coral bells in a pot in my back on my back deck. This is a green form. There's red forms. There's orange forms. There's chartreuse. There's literally there's new forms coming out every year. But I like this one because of the mottled foliage that it has. One of the things that I've determined is if you can find out the kind of the genetics of the plant, whether it's a variety like a Euchera villosa, those seem to be a little bit more drought tolerant than say some of the other different kinds of Eucheras that are out there. But I love the green foliage, has white blooms, creamy white blooms later in the late spring, early summer. Woodland phlox, if you go to eastern Kansas in the springtime, usually in late April and into May, you will find this growing in shaded areas, different forms, different colors. There's whites, there's dark purples, but a nice plant for a shaded area will slowly spread and fill in, especially if it's happy. Most of these plants, the shade plants, appreciate some organic matter. I mentioned earlier that organic matter is not great for some of the sun-loving plants. Organic matter, compost, leaf litter is really helpful, especially for growing shade plants here in South Central Kansas. Holds a little bit more soil. The soil doesn't dry out as quickly, and they really appreciate a little bit of compost or organic matter, which mimics where they naturally grow, and more in eastern Kansas. Golden ragwort, yellow blooms in the springtime. Can shear these off. This is an evergreen, has evergreen foliage. Shear these off when they're done blooming, and only gets 8 to 12 inches tall. Different kinds of goldenrods. There's blue stem goldenrod. There's elm leaf goldenrod, which is pictured here. Those are goldenrods that can grow in some shady situations. Again, provide late season bloom when a lot of other, when there isn't a lot else going on in a shade garden. It's nice to have these splashes of color within the landscape, these vibrant yellow blooms. Pollinators will flock to them as well. And then different kinds of shade tolerant sedges. There's Carex pennsylvanica, which is more of a spreader. Carex rosea is more of a clump former, along with Carex appalachia and Carex texensis. Those stay more as clumps, but great for incorporating and letting fill in and underneath say an oak tree, like I've done and working on in my own backyard. So some natives for shade. There's some spring ephemerals like bloodroot, spring beauty, jack in the pulpit, shooting star, yellow wood poppy, which is really an attractive plant, Virginia bluebells, mayaples. These spring ephemerals, they bloom and then they disappear once the trees, once the canopy and the leaves start to fill in. So then you can incorporate some of these other more persistent perennials, shade perennials within the landscape. So I mentioned earlier groupings of plants for say a rock garden. If you go to the list here on the left, these are plants that need pretty good drainage, appreciate drainage. Not that some of these can't be crossed over and can grow in clay soils, because I think in certain situations that they can. But this is a listing of plants that need pretty good drainage, appreciate good drainage, kind of in this rock garden setting. These are plant communities that you would see naturally growing together out in the wild. And these clay soils, kind of say the middle of a hilltop, or areas where the soil is a little bit better, a little bit richer, you would find some of these other perennials here under the clay soil category. They can handle a little bit more fluctuation in soil moisture, can handle growing through and breaking through the hard pan of a clay soil. And we've had good success with a lot of these growing here in our heavy clay soils in Harvey County here at the Arboretum. So this is just a list I put together, and it really kind of highlights and thinking and lets you kind of as a starting point of what plants grow well in community together. And then as you think about your own landscape, we put together years ago some recipe cards. Evening primrose, smooth penstemon, blue star, little blue stem, asters for fall, and grouping them in different bloom times, and then incorporating those together within a design. Sun lovers recipe, plan B, and then those garden designs put together here. These are just examples, but this is kind of a starting point as you think about your own landscape and matching up the plants that you have. You can go to our native plant guide. You can go to the internet, learn more about each one of these plants or plants that you want to try to incorporate within the garden. Really, it's up to you to decide which plants work best in your landscape. And sometimes it's just trial and error. We have areas and different display beds within the Arboretum that there's plants that have been thriving there for 10 or 15 years. There's other areas that are newer where we're trying some plants, and there's always seems like there's one or two that are kind of marginal to matching up with that site, and they struggle, and sometimes they're kind of on life support. Those are the indicator plants. It's like when you know that that plant is wilting, you know that that bed maybe needs some supplemental moisture, or it's an indicator plant that maybe that plant isn't happy. You need to move it to an area where maybe it's a little more protected, or maybe it's needs to be moved to an area where it gets a little more sunlight. And again, there's trial and error and moving. Sometimes you have to move these plants in order for them to find where they like to grow best. Within our prairie setting here at the Arboretum, we have seen over the years plants move on their own. Plants that were once on the top of a hill have now moved and are happier in a setting that's a little bit further down a hill, or in the bottom of a hill. Plants that were at the bottom, and now you're seeing new plants coming up, and they kind of move on their own, and they find the places where they like to grow the best. But plants are quite adaptable, but it's really important for you to learn more as much as you can about them and incorporate those in a way that matches the site that you have. Whether it's something small like this, I really like this kind of simplistic design with the fence, and as a backdrop, a redbud tree there with a few perennials mixed together with some grasses. Or it could be a more substantial planting leading to a garden path, along a garden path to a garden shed. There's any number of ways you can incorporate these plants, but hopefully I've answered. Hopefully there isn't too many questions, but we can hopefully you can find plants that work well in your landscape, and again, they're quite adaptable and can match the site that you have. Be happy to answer questions, and we can go from there.